Well, okay, just as we are going to be recording this, ask all our guests to mute their microphones and perhaps also turn their cameras off as well during it. We're also recording the messages and everything else that go with this recording as well. So it'll just be Andrew on, or Andy on the video, and I'll turn myself off as well. And we look forward to your presentation, Andy, and perhaps like you to introduce yourself just before you get going as well, just very slightly. Yeah, that's more. Okay.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's a really good opportunity to speak to you. So I'm really grateful for you welcoming me into your community to share some of my areas of research and application with you. So my name's Andy Hailey, and I coach at an international school in Singapore. And when I've been working there, especially over the last 3 years, I've been exploring different pedagogical approaches, different kind of philosophical foundation points that have changed the way that I coach and how I design curriculums. And it's something that we've introduced at the school, and also within the competitive stream as well for swimming. What I do is I start sharing the presentation because there's a nice little opening video that I'd like to share. So whilst people are coming in, hopefully we can get the sound from this video. This is a great introduction to this talk by Bruce Lee. So I think everyone's familiar with.
You see, actually, I do not teach, karate because I do not believe in styles anymore. I mean, I do not believe that there is such thing as like Chinese way of fighting or the Japanese way of fighting or whatever way of fighting, because unless human beings have 3 arms and 4 legs, we will have a different form of fighting. But basically, we have only 2 hands and 2 feet. So styles tends to not only separate man, because they have their own doctrines, and then the doctrine became the gospel truth, that you cannot change, But if you do not have styles, you just say, well, here I am, as a human being, how can I express myself totally and completely? Now, that way, you won't create a style, because style is a crystallization, I mean, that way it's a process of continuing growth.
Cool. I think it's always a really nice opener when I share that video, and I just love the way he talks about this idea of there not being a way, and in a longer version of the interview he talks about a way, kind of if you find a way, you've actually lost the way in a sense. And I'll kind of touch on a bit more about that as we go on, and this idea of styles and performance templates and models, and actually where we can start to recognize their value and what they've done for us in the past, but actually where we can start to move away from them and to start to change our approach. So kind of how did I end up from just being a school coach and a PE teacher into this area? Years ago, I met Dr. Stephen Cobley from the University of Sydney, and I was fortunate to work with Dr. Richard Shuttleworth at the school for a couple of years. And through completing a master's and linking up with some different universities around the world, I started to get more and more kind of, you could say going down the rabbit hole, but I think it's not as kind of like losing myself as that term suggests, but I was able to kind of start picking at threads and start to see a bigger picture on how do we start to improve some of the big areas that we're confronted and some of the big problems that we're confronted with in the sport. And a lot of this will touch on areas that aren't unique to swimming at all, and they're actually faced from a physical health and public health position, going through physical education and other sports. We talk about some of the big ones like dropout and motivations, and how will this approach, when I go into a bit more detail, you'll start to hopefully have little light bulb moments that I had in, well, how this might actually help. I think we be careful to say this is a silver bullet for anything, but we can definitely see, well, we can look at things from a different perspective and how we can support dropout and areas around motivation for our students. And one of the big driving questions was on one of those pandemic time virtual talks that a lot of coaches were doing. And one of the talks that Coach Sergio Lopez put forward was, has swimming reached its peak? And we are talking about performance at this point. And that question really kind of hit me, and it led me to look from the top down and to keep coming down. Well, where are we going? I wouldn't necessarily say wrong, but where could we improve that could then maybe answer a question in a different way to, has swimming reached its peak? So the area that I kind of started getting into was around ecological psychology, and a more recent concept called ecological dynamics. So a bit of history around this approach and kind of what we could say a traditional approach. And I use the word traditional quite a bit, but I think with that word, it shouldn't be seen as a negative word. It should be seen as, well, what was traditional was probably once contemporary, and what is contemporary now will one day be traditional as well. I just use it as a way that we can understand what has defined skill acquisition and motor learning over the last maybe 60 odd years. And a lot of this kind of grew from the Second World War with specialists looking into how do they improve fighter pilots, how do they improve their attacking capabilities, how do their survival rates, how to shoot down more planes. And some really key leading figures in the area, such as Paul Fitz and James Gibson, helped try to conceptualize what goes on and the mechanics of learning. And the kind of the dominant theory, some of you may be aware of, it's taught in, even in PE curriculums for kids at school, it's this idea around information processing. And this idea that the brain, the mind and the body are separate entities, and that learning is a case of kind of programming the brain to then kind of coordinate like a mechanic or like a robot kind of sequencing to then perform a movement change or a behavior change. But what that's kind of done, and when we look at this kind of concept, we start to see potentially where some of the potential errors are in assuming that children or anyone is learning. And this idea that if something works well, it then becomes the template, which then becomes the gospel, which then becomes the doctrine, which is what Bruce Lee alluded to in his video at the start. Once you've found the way, it then becomes crystallized, it's fixed. And then what you're trying to do from modeling set point of view, it's trying to then reduce the errors out of the equation to get the perfect performance and the perfect model of things. And if you imagine a child being put into one of these models or templates, and you start to respect the interaction with the environment, when you're cutting away these opportunities for our perceived error, you're limiting the landscape of opportunity for them to explore into. So then you can start to see, well, if you've got a child who has got literally less opportunity and you've put them in a tight box, well, we could see, well, the one thing you do when you get put in a tight box is you want to get out. So these kind of like myths of yesterday and these templates are overly constraining the swimmers and the learners into a way. And hopefully what I'm going to kind of try and get across through the presentation is an alternative, but also please appreciate there's no criticism of a way before and a way now, and to look at things maybe more on a continuum rather than a this or that kind of approach. So ecological psychology and the ecological approach's key point is the interaction between the individual and the organism, and this differs from the kind of the positions from information processing, which traditionally kind of puts all the emphasis on the body, on the individual, and neglects what's happening in the surrounding, in the environment. Whereas from an ecological position, there's a respect of equal worth between the two, and it's the point where the two meet. That's where the emergence of learning can happen. So just from a kind of a position, we start to look at along this continuum here, the prescribed teaching through to discovery learning. And I think those of you who have done any teaching, or especially in schools, we hear a lot about things like guided discovery learning. I just think this is a really nice way, an illustration of how when you try to over-constrain someone, you limit their opportunities, you do end up a bit tangled. Whereas with implicit kind of learning, you get this kind of self-regulation, self-organization of movement for the individual. So now we're starting to move away from a coach-controlled, coach-focused approach to more of an athlete-centered one or student-centered one. And I think when I first started looking at this, I was like, well, you can't just kind of let them go off and do what they want. You know, there's things like safety, and you know, how do you let them explore but keep them safe without limiting them too much? And that is a big part of the challenge of being a coach. But at the same time, as I've gone through this, it's not as difficult as it first appears. You know, and you use that experience that you have to make sure the environment is kept safe, but you're also supporting a kind of risk-taking, exploratory kind of behavior. And the importance here is this area around implicit learning as opposed to explicit. So you have another continuum here. And I think it's important that as from a learning point of view, we want to keep it down that implicit end as much as possible. And this has been really interesting reading research around rehab and sport injuries, when they're trying, you know, if they've ruptured an ACL or something, they're coming back in, they're trying to relearn certain skills. Having it learned implicitly has meant the focus is not on kind of trying to regulate their movement kind of like in a mechanical way, which usually is what they found is led to re-injury, because they're not able to kind of couple with their environment. They're not able to kind of just have that natural response to what's going on, and they're too busy thinking about, you know, activating their glute to control their knee, and then suddenly, you know, the injuries happen again because they're kind of trying to follow an explicit set of instructions. So just a good example of how the environment actually helps us shape the way that we learn, and its importance and relevance in this whole game is this nice video here. So what we so what you can appreciate with this video that's quite entertaining is how this guy has obviously shaped his technique. The ultimate problem at the end of this is to hit the ball, get the club face on the ball at the right angle to make it connect and have a good shot. And you can see where his learning environment has shaped his techniques in order to solve that problem in quite a unique way based on the room he's got around his boundary on his balcony. So this is a kind of a good illustration of learning environment. So one of the key areas in from an ecological position is this idea of perception action coupling. And it's important that we look to provide the learners with this opportunity to couple with relevant information in the environment, so become perceptually attuned. And a really good example of this, some of you have probably seen, is this lovely video of Cristiano Ronaldo when they switched the lights off. But his ability to couple with what's happening in his environment is incredible. What they do is they switch the lights off, and he's able to execute the skill without even being able to see the ball. So what he's able to do is he's able to pick up on his affordances. He's able to pick up on information from the crosser and couple with the movement trajectory of the ball based on how hard the crosser is kicking the ball, how high he's swinging his leg. All this information feeds in so that he can couple with executing the skill of getting the ball in the net. And it's important to recognize, obviously, we're not all Cristiano Ronaldo, and he's a very skillful player. So it's kind of, how do we develop to this kind of point where we can be attuned with our environment? And different levels of ability are perceived individually. So what we can start to look at is, how do you manipulate the environment or the task or the individual in order to try and get these different adaptive kind of learning situations happening, and this emergent skill kind of showing itself and adaptation. So if you watch this videos of, here's my little boy, this is when he was 18 months, trying to open a car door. And you watch clearly, because I've got the one on the right is me opening the door after him. And ultimately, the skill is to get the door open and get inside the car. So think about what I mentioned in the last slide about perception and your action point. Where do you see the world? And you notice how he did manage to get the door open in the end. And this is me coming up to the door. It's a very quick video. It's not particularly interesting, but just look at the difference in how I approach it. Okay. So you can see a difference. My son had his knuckles facing up, and my knuckles were facing down when I went up to the door handle. So he's seeing the problem of opening the door, but he's seeing it from his understanding of his strength. You know, he struggled to even get the door open. Height, whereas my height is coming down onto the door handle, his is up. What dexterity does he have in his hands to even open the door? You know, he was trying to do it all from his thumb, which is quite hard. But that's all. That's what he sees from his point of view, but also from his skill level. So it's very different to mine. So this is something to be aware of as coaches and teachers, that the perceived environment is different to each individual. So this bring it into more swimming related. Here's my son again. This is fairly recently, so he's 2.5 here. And I took this idea of trying really hard to get a viewpoint from his perception on how to help him with his swimming. Now, I used to teach learn to swim when I was younger, and you know, I'd be in the water like I am now, and I'd found I'd stand up, and I'd be teaching the kids holding their floats, but I'd be stood up. Now, what I noticed with my son and some of his friends when they came down to play at the pool is they want to look at you in the eyes. So if I'm stood up, that's maybe 2 or 3 feet above the water, depending on the depth I'm in. He's going to be trying to look up in the water, which is going to force his hips to sink down. So what I started to do is I started to swim almost underwater underneath him. So he's looking at me, but also if I am above the water, my head's very low, so that he's not having to force and crank his head up. And I think the important thing here is I've never spoken to him about doing strokes. We've not looked at alternate arms. You know, we haven't even looked at any kind of kicking. It's just been a case of playing and figuring out where his attention kind of goes to. And usually it's to a toy I've got in my hand, or on the pool side, or if he's seen his friend somewhere else in the pool and he wants to get to them. And you know, the day after this, he managed to swim to the other side, which obviously I'm a very proud parent for this. But the reason why I'm sharing it is looking at the difference between him and what I've seen some of his friends that come along. The head goes up. You know, we've all kind of seen it. Head goes right up and the legs drop down. And we're trying to encourage arms to go forwards. But the way I looked at it is he's more naturally equipped to just have his hands by his side, because that's how he walks around. That's how he's balancing. So I've not encouraged him at this stage because of his kind of skill level, a bit like with the door opening. I don't want to, you know, his ability to float and to move himself is in the position that he's most comfortable with balancing. So now we have a position where he's able to exploit a certain situation, which he's already kind of comfortable with. And what I'm trying to encourage him to do, by being that kind of attractive force further away, because I'm calling him, is I'm trying to get him to now exploit the water to make sure he can get his enough kind of sculling action underwater. He can lift his head up and breathe, get it back down and keep flat. Because the time we did this before, his legs went down a bit and he choked on a bit of water. So there's like that balance point between what he can currently do to that exploration and willingness to take the risk. So we come into looking at the differences in the role of the coach. And as I've mentioned a bit before, we have say a traditional point of view where we're looking at a coach led in a position of the knowledge giver. It's kind of like an all-knowing figure that implants knowledge into the learner. We look to correct errors based on a performance template, which is, you know, it can vary from coach to coach. I think we probably agree that it does, because we all have our different ways of doing things. And another key one is that we try to reduce movements into parts to perfect and then reassemble. Whereas when we start to appreciate, I think all coaches kind of agree on a point where people as an entity are very complex. And when we start to look at and accept that we are complex, adaptive systems, breaking everyone apart and trying to, it's impossible to do. And whereas what we should be looking at is more of an integrationist or simplification kind of point of view. So again, we're on this another continuum. And we can probably think about where skills could be more integrationist and where some skills could be reduced a little bit, or reduced if there's a need. Generally, we look at linear progressions. So it's kind of like a step by step. You go from level 1 to level 2 to level 3 to level 4. And that's kind of a traditional way. And the other key area here is the focus is on this idea of the knowledge about the world. So I'm telling you about what's happening in the sea as a surfer. You know, I'm telling you that you need to paddle out there, you need to sit on your board, and you need to paddle when a wave comes. When you get on the wave, you stand up. In contrast, from an ecological position, we're looking at around the knowledge of, and this would be, you know, those of you who surf, you know, you're not trying to catch every wave. You see the surfers out there kind of sitting for quite a long time, feeling what's happening with the movement of the water, the tides, the different sets coming in. Do you just go for the biggest one, the smallest one? Which one's going to give you opportunity to do different sections, you know, different parts of the reef? And this is the kind of difference between a knowledge about something and this knowledge of. And the knowledge of is a demonstration of your attunement to the environment. And that's really what we want as educators, to have the students kind of learn, and they start to learn this knowledge of the world, as opposed to just knowing about it. And when we start to look into this kind of athlete-led, and how do we kind of support that, we're changing this position of the coach being the knowledge giver to the coach being the guide. This kind of, you could say, like Gandalf kind of figure in an educational relationship sense, of supporting their way through the landscapes of opportunity. And it's kind of what constraints can a coach manipulate to change what the opportunities that they come across, so that they adapt and they can learn. And what we find is it's a much more holistic way of supporting to the needs of the individual, as opposed to kind of the one size fits all templates. So when it comes to designing kind of curriculums, and I've just pulled a couple of images off Google here, and we start to think about swimming and its need in society. In my school where I work, we've got about 8 to 9% of the student population currently are in the swimming program. The rest, and this is a school of about 3,000 students, the rest are, they're not interested in competitive swimming. But we do have a responsibility as a school and society to make sure that they're safe when they interact with water. And this is one of the big things, we sadly see a lot of headlines of kids drowning around the world. And you have to think, well, is the way that we're teaching complementing the risks and the environment that people, not just children, are being faced with in order to make sure that they stay alive? So we've changed the curriculum in a way that starts to look at the way we teach is representative to the problem that we're trying to solve. So at a young age, generality of kind of practice, so we get lots of transfer between activities that is working towards a familiarity and a water literacy that keeps kids safe. I did the same. I use my son a lot for examples, but during the pandemic, I was only really around my family for a lot of it. The key for me is that if he falls in that pool, can he get back to the side and at least keep his mouth and nose above the water? And it comes down to kind of the key principles around swimming is increasing propulsion and decreasing drag. And it doesn't matter if you're trying to keep your head above water, survive, or you're trying to win an Olympic medal. Those two in unison, in a kind of coordinating kind of cycle, that it relates to both. And the way we kind of look at the kind of curriculum now is this idea of task specificity and this generality of the task. So at a younger age, we're looking at more generality to get more transfer, as opposed to making it too specific. So when we have young kids, like my son's age and older, trying to teach butterfly, breaststroke, backstroke, and freestyle, I mean, they all just rule. They're just strokes that have got rules in a competitive setting. So those rules and those strokes are actually would constrain the type of movement that they can learn. So they're not able actually to just explore, which is the main problem from their point of view, which is just to save, keep themselves safe, float, roll on their backs, get to the side. Although my son can swim across, it's almost 15 meters now. He hates going on his back. And my wife said to me, we need to get him practicing more on his back. I said, look, he can fall in and he can get to the side. He can fall in and he can swim to the side. I'm okay with that for now. We can teach him how to roll on his back another time, but we can still do games that encourage him to roll over so that he starts to get kind of more comfortable without, he's 2.5. If you told him to roll on his back, he's just going to scream Paw Patrol at me and probably run off. So there's no point in kind of that explicit information, but I can definitely get the toys out and the different games out that would encourage him to be on his back more. But I also just have to weigh that up with is it really necessary right now? Is it the prime goal? And something that we kind of look at to simplify this down is we look at doing something right, so we keep the coordination and the complexity quite low. We then look to try and do it fast, and so we're kind of looking at this position where we're adapting things under another constraint by bringing maybe time or speed into the equation, and then we're looking to try and do it fast under pressure. So that's where you start to bring in a bit more maybe performance pressure or competitive element in, which encourages that movement from exploiting something into exploration, which then can be exploited again based on what opportunities you have in front of you. I mentioned earlier about affordances, and I've tried deliberately to use the word opportunities. So affordance is like opportunities that are in the environment all around us, from the atmospheric pressure to the surface of the ground, to the temperature, to the physical obstacles, to relationships with other people. They're all opportunities and affordances, and they all impact on the learner. So when we're trying to look at generality of practice for these younger kids, you know, you can see here, and I've taken this from a paper from Stafford in 2018. You can see how where team sports and parkour complement each other. There's an overlap of affordances in there. So we can design games that don't need to be football or netball or even parkour. We just have a playground, and we can do team sports in a playground setting. So we can start to get these kind of overlaps of opportunity, and it supports that general transfer of learning. As I mentioned earlier, this is taken from Fabio Ote's work, and I called it "Do It Right, Do It Fast, and Do It Fast Under Pressure." But essentially, it's that kind of coordination training, movement coordination, to try and find stability in your actions. Then you can start to go into this kind of learning and adapting, increasing the variability and the complexity of what you're doing, and then you put it under that kind of performance pressure. And we all know that in games and in situations, you change when the pressure of competition is on, or there's the competition could be of you've fallen in, you've got to save your life. It will change the way that you move and how you behave. So a big key part of this is an understanding of making sure that what we are teaching and supporting is representative to the individual's perception of the environment they could be faced with, whether that's a competitive environment or an outdoor setting, which, you know, saving their life saving is the kind of the performance setting. So we can move on to looking at constraints. So I mentioned earlier how constraints in the sense of kind of traditional kind of teaching and coaching, putting templates around, kind of overly constrains what kids can do. You're taking away those affordances. You imagine that big landscape of affordances. Error correction limits the movements possible because you're telling them to do something explicit, and it starts to cut away the affordances in the landscape. So suddenly, rather than having all these nice overlaps and opportunities, you're now limited. But what we can also look to do is use constraints to manipulate the task or the environment or the individual themselves to help guide and change the landscapes in front of them so they adapt in different ways. And one of the key areas for this is something called repetition without repetition, from Bernstein in 1967. And the idea is quite simple. Rather than the coach being sort of the person who is a solution finder for a problem, the coach is now the problem designer. And we accept that in the sense of nonlinear pedagogy, there's multiple ways to solve the same problem, and you might not use the same way twice. You know, look at the door opening scene. You know, my son and I, we all get faced with different car doors and different door handles all the time. We use different techniques based on what's in front of us. So that's an example of how different kind of constraints on what the overall problem is causes behavior changes. So we want to find as many different and support as many different solutions to solving the problem for the learner, and it kind of equips them with a bigger repertoire of skills. And I spoke briefly about this kind of idea of a challenge point, this meta-stability attunement between what they can currently exploit and the exploration. And there's a real need to appreciate if the exploration point is deemed to be too risky or life-threatening, you know, you're probably not going to get that step forwards. They're not going to want to explore. So as a coach, we need to be very careful of making sure that that room for exploration is safe and it's as well as attractive. And we can start to look at this kind of lovely schematic about how this might work And we want to be able to be into to move into a zone of uncertainty, which is safe, obviously, as opposed to an area that's unsafe and uncertain. But we also have kind of this idea that with traditional models, we could be in this realm of being too certain and safe all the time, which doesn't encourage learning. It doesn't encourage risk-taking and adaptive behavior. So when we're kind of looking at what things to manipulate and what constraints to use, what performance landscapes we're trying to create that are representative to the problem, we need to be thinking along this line of creating a field of uncertainty, especially from time to time, that encourages that exploration behavior. When you start to take those risks and you explore, it encourages the self-regulation, the self-organization of movement to overcome the problem. And this is where the idea that failure is a process of learning, and failure is more a series of attempts than a series of failures. So here we got the way that the kind of constraints kind of mold together, and there's some examples on this schematic here. And what they do is when you change these constraints, like any in the boxes that you can see, the perception action coupling, which is labeled here information and movement, they will change based on what kind of affordances you have. That attunement leads to the functional movement solutions, the changes in what action you end up taking in order to self-organize to overcome the problem, how you self-organize your movement to adapt. So here I've got an example of using constraints with one of my swimmers. Let's have a look at her. I'm sorry about the quality of the video, but you can see quite quickly what the issue is with her kick. Okay, so there's a couple of points there. You probably see a couple of the kicks that are, you see that it's like what we'd probably say like a screw kick. So for this swimmer, she's obviously a competitive swimmer. So there's rules of the stroke which are going to constrain what I am able to do as a coach, and what I need to do as a coach to help her sort of legal breaststroke. So what we did is I used one of those little sinker hoops to put on her ankle. And what we did, we had a look at what happened kind of when they're around the ankles and what did it do to her movement. And you can see like that was one of the first attempts. You see the hoops kind of came off because she was pointing her toes, you know, and she wasn't bringing her toes up towards her knees. She wasn't flexing properly. But that's an okay because it's an attempt. Now I'm not going to do anything else other than let her try, because really the feedback is coming from the hoop and not from me. My job is just to facilitate her attempts. And what I could do if the task was too hard, you know, I could look at changing the hoop, changing what's around the ankle, using a different form of equipment to encourage the legs being closer together, you know, all sorts of things like that, rather than explicitly telling her. Because as we know with screw kick, you can show videos and you can say it to your blue in the face, but it's not really going to solve a screw kick. Now you can see the change in the way she's kicking, keeping the hoops on. Here's a couple of other examples, courtesy of my friend Andrew Sheaf, of how we can use constraints to help that kind of interaction with the environment. So we've got the paddle cat freestyle. I'll show you the shorter video of some of my swimmers. So the paddle is on the front of their head. Okay, and what they've done here is we'd already done a few weeks of them just swimming up and down with the paddles just at their own time. And what I started to do now is I said, well, I want you to play around with the tempo of your strokes. So by slowing down the arms, it obviously changes the pressure on the head. So it encourages the legs to start to kick hard to maintain the pressure on the paddle to keep it on the head. Here we have some ideas of performance kind of challenges and how we use constraints to influence changes in training. So from a coaching point of view, we have volume is just a constraint that we can play around with. So where I've put 850s here, you could easily just put a question mark and a time frame. How many 50s can you do, counting the strokes and counting the time in seconds, and you've got 15 minutes to get your best score. So then it becomes individual, and you start to tap into kind of this a bit like the AMRAP they do in kind of CrossFit. How good am I feeling in this moment to try and challenge myself and push myself more? And playing around with stroke time and the stroke count are constraints. Heart rate, if you swim, I want you to maintain pace. I want you to try and keep your heart rate under 170, for example. So you've got to try and, the swimmers then got to try and swim as fast as they can whilst maintaining a heart rate that's under 170. So it increases their awareness of how they're feeling. To kind of wrap this up into a frame, this is taken again from Fabio's work. We start to see how this is kind of conceptualized in a role frame here. And you've got this nicely put image down here of the coach and how they're thinking about the athlete environment and ways to kind of improve the perception action couplings, with an acceptance of one of this great concept here from Carl Woods of wayfinding. This idea that every individual has a way of finding their way through the landscape, and as a coach, we are there to kind of help guide them. And sometimes the landscape can be so big that we can use things like demonstration and visuals to help them find that solution space. And I sometimes describe this as like, if you wanted to walk into a pub or a bar and you're looking to play darts, you might ask the barman, where's the dartboard? They might say, oh, the room in the back. They haven't told you how to play darts. They haven't done anything else. They've just kind of guided you to the room when you know the information you need is there. So this is a really nice, it's quite a busy kind of schematic, but it's a really good one. And these are just some of the references. I thought I'd add them in case anybody wanted to read up on a bit more. And that's the end of my presentation.
Oh, camera. Hi, thank you, Andy. That was really good. Does anybody have any questions of Andy at all at this time?
Sorry, just had the volume turned down a little bit there.
It's all right.
Yeah, open for any questions. Yeah, go ahead. It's quite a short time to get things to go into any detail around anything. Hopefully I've covered some of the main areas as I can. So hopefully some questions might be able to help summarize any points or just tidy up any areas.
Yeah. I've got a question
in the chat as well.
Yeah, I've got a question. How long do you leave somebody in that state of discovery, if you like? What are your key influences for actually helping them change into another level?
Difficult to answer because it assumes that they're going to neatly kind of go from one step to the other, which it doesn't. You can basically get big skips in advancement in learning. If any of you've got kids, I mean, having my son doing my master's through this has been incredible because, as you can tell, I've used him as a bit of a guinea pig. But watching him, he didn't crawl very long. He just stood up and started walking. So he made that leap from crawling. It wasn't like he went from crawling to kneeling to standing to cruising to walking. He just crawled, and one day he just let go of the sofa and started walking. So it isn't as simple as kind of going, oh, you've hit this milestone now, you can move on. The idea is that actually that question that you've asked me is instilled in the individual. Are they seeing the opportunity to take that next exploration step? Because what they'll find is they'll get to a point where they can exploit that situation now, and they've adapted and tuned, and now they're looking, you know, they're searching for the next one. And we're not just talking one at a time, we're talking multiple. This is going on a multi-faceted level.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating stuff, actually. It's really good. Anybody else have anything they would like to ask of Andy before we?
Yeah, Andy, it's Scott here. Loved your presentation. Thank you for that. Made me think. But just a couple of questions. One is, did the level of engagement of the pupils, the swimmers, change, and into what way? And maybe you've got a slightly different audience because you're in a captured school area. But I just wondered how parents may see this in a traditional Australian, New Zealand swim school situation. I'd like to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, good questions. So anecdotally, there is research coming out more now around motivation. There's a really good paper by Kylie Moulds from the University of Sydney. That was on demotivation, dropout, burnout. There's a meta-analysis of kind of getting a definition of those terms. And she used an ecological systems theory approach to answering the dropout, and it's a really good one to read, because what that describes is where we have situations where affordances are cut down, the level of motivation drops. And it's an appreciation that motivation doesn't sit from an ecological point of view, as much as I respect self-determination theory and things like that as well. The motivation sits at the connecting point between the individual and the environment. And so if you start to limit what's available in that environment, there's less opportunity for that motivation kind of to coexist. And anecdotally, I've seen this not just with the kids, but also the staff that I work with. When we changed the curriculum, traditionally PE teachers used to come to me quite almost scared to kind of go ahead with swimming lessons. They'd want to know, oh, how would you do this? How would you do it? What do you do? Whereas now we've changed this new approach, they're able to use the talents that they've always had as teachers and run classes. They're more engaged because they're not trapped by thinking that there's a swimming model that should be come from the swimming coach. And they're also able to get more engaged in what they're doing. So their motivation as the teachers is going up. And when I go past the pool, you know, a classic year 9 lesson, girls or boys, you've usually got about a third of the class sitting out. I don't see that anymore. And I've asked the teacher, you know, are you putting more pressure on them? And they're like, no, we just have changed the curriculum. You know, when they turn up, we're not doing front crawl for 8 weeks. You know, we are doing activities that will encourage you to use an optimal form of stroke to overcome a problem. Now, that might be front crawl. And remember, in this PE context, we're not looking at creating the next Olympians. You know, that's the competitive swimming kind of area. This is about increasing the level of water literacy, which is so important for lifelong physical activity. From a parent position, my friend Rick, he's just been sat with me. I think he did a paper, and it was discussing where coaches who use this approach sometimes feel like they're absent from the process. And I guess if you're looking for a parent kind of position, you know, could be deemed the same. I would stress though, because I'm not giving the knowledge giver and throwing in instructions, that does not mean that I'm not involved in the coaching process. If you were to actually come and walk past me coach, you'd see nothing really different in what I'm doing on poolside. But the language I use is different, and the tasks I'm using are different. And I'm comparing myself to my older self when I refer to this. You know, I'm still very much in the process. I had one coach tell me, you know, but with the discovery learning, you know, you're not involved. You know, the kids need the coach to kind of push them along. I said, there's at no point have I said, you know, you can't encourage a child. You can't get involved from that perspective. So I think if you're looking from a parent position, I think we shouldn't be too worried about thinking that we're not kind of involved at all, because we very much are. Those landscapes, that representative task design, those environments still need to be created by the coach. If anything, what it does is it frees up a coach and a teacher to, rather than being kind of this instructor, knowledge giver based on a curriculum, as you like. We just have the freedom to coach what's in front of us.
Hey, thanks, Andy.
No worries.
If there's nothing else, we can wrap that up if there's no other questions at all. But yeah, thank you, Andy. That was just fantastic, and really appreciate your
No problem
views
at all. Thank you for having me.
and ideas. They're really great. Thank you very much.
Very much.
Susan, what I can do is I can share my, or I